how's it going? Matthew Bailey Media here, and welcome to my another tier list video. Now, if y'all remember, I did the DCU movies, or DCEU, I mean, movies for DC. Now I'm about to finally do my MCU tier list. Now, this will include not just the Disney Plus shows that have been coming out since 2021 for Marvel, but I will be including the Netflix Marvel shows that have come out. Everything except Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So things like Daredevil, Jessica Jones, The Defenders, Luke Cage, Iron Fist. Those are going to be included in here. Now, unfortunately, I have not seen all of the Netflix Marvel stuff. You'll probably see what I mean when we get into the video, but for now, let's get into this tier list of my rankings for the MCU movies and TV shows. Hey guys, so as I said in the beginning of this video, welcome to my tier list for the MCU movies and shows that have come out so far. Now, the reason why I'm making this video is because I did the DCEU movies list. I just haven't done the MCU stuff. Now, I may have to make multiple versions of this video, like as more and more MCU stuff comes out. Like the next one we got coming out is Deadpool and Wolverine, which is probably going to end up being a really good film. And we got some shows like the Agatha show coming out. We got a reboot, sort of a revival to Daredevil, which is on this list. If you can't see at the bottom of the screen, but we're going to talk about Daredevil in a little bit. But for now, I'm going to be ranking each and every movie and show that's part of the MCU and what I thought of it and how I'm really excited for the future of Marvel, especially now that we're in the multiverse saga. But for now, let's start off with the first movie that ever came out in the MCU, which was the very first Iron Man. Now, I will say a lot of people didn't think Robert Downey Jr. could pull off being Iron Man, especially because apparently the actor who Robert Downey Jr. did have some like situations back before he became Iron Man, where he apparently got arrested in the early 2000s, and he for something, I'm not sure what it was specifically, but he apparently did not do a lot of stuff. But apparently Iron Man is what really kicked off his career in movies, and that's why I feel like the first Iron Man movie, I will say I love the way it was the beginning of the MCU, and I love how they handled it. And I gotta say, I still think it was an okay movie to probably end up being in the here we go, the B tier. Like I said, it's a decent film. Again, it was the start of the MCU, and I really liked how they ended it, or they started it, I mean. And I'm really curious to see like what the future holds for the Iron Man character, especially once the multiverse saga is over, and if Robert Downey Jr. comes back to play a variant of Tony Stark. I'm curious to see like how they're gonna reboot his character after Secret Wars. So we'll see how that turns out. Next up, we got the Incredible Hulk movie from 2008 with Edward Norton as Bruce Banner instead of Mark Ruffalo. Now, this is one of the few movies that came out in the same year as the first Iron Man that, to be fair, I don't even think they originally were considering this to be part of the MCU, but to be fair, they did have certain characters from that movie make appearances. Like Robert Downey Jr. showed up as Iron Man, so that's probably why the whole thing happened. I will say, though, I didn't think it was a bad movie. In fact, it wasn't as bad to the point where I'll probably put it in the C tier. I thought it was an okay film. Next up, we got Iron Man 2. Now, funny enough, Iron Man 2 was supposed to technically take place before The Incredible Hulk does, because, again, they weren't originally considering this to be a part of the MCU until they had to add that one mid-credit scene where Tony Stark shows up and next to Thunderbolt Ross and tells them about putting the team together and everything, which is what we see in a scene in Iron Man 2. Slight spoiler for anyone who hasn't seen Iron Man 2. But I will say the villain in Iron Man 2, I gotta say it was sort of a downgrade from the first movie's villain, but I still think it was pretty intense with how this movie turned out. And plus, this is the first time we actually get Scarlett Johansson in here as Black Widow in the MCU, so I will say I think it was definitely better than the first Incredible Hulk movie, and only one that we've gotten. So we got that out of the way. Next up, we got the first Thor movie. Now, Thor, I gotta say, I appreciated how they handled this, because this technically also took place after the events of Iron Man 2, where a mid-credits scene showed Thor's hammer. Now, I don't know if they had cast Chris Hemsworth right around the time that Iron Man 2 was filmed and they had that hammer in the background, but I will say this movie was a good way to introduce Thor's character and sort of set up the first Avengers movie in a way. And I will say I still think it was worthy enough to be in the C tier at least. Again, these movies I think are okay, they just aren't as good as I was hoping for them to be. Next up, we got Captain America, the First Avenger. Now, again, this is the very first movie to introduce Captain America, and it sort of takes place before the events of all of these movies that I just named. And it shows the origin of Captain America and what he was like during the World War II era, and with the Red Skull and Hydra. Again, unlike its follow-ups, the first Captain America I thought was not as good as I was hoping for it to be, but it was definitely a good way to introduce him. And I still think it was better than these three movies, if I'm being totally honest. Now we get to the really big things. We get the first Avengers movie, Avengers Assemble. Now, I think that's what it's called, or maybe it's just called The Avengers, but this is the first time where we see all the heroes team up, including both, like I said, Natasha Romanoff, played by Scarlett Johansson, and even Jeremy Renner as Hawkeye, who we did get introduced to in the first Thor movie. And I will say this was a good way to start off a team-up movie with the Avengers. And I will say, I actually do find it really much better than the first Iron Man movie. But plus, it was the last movie of Phase 1 of the MCU to come out. So I really enjoyed it. Now we get to Iron Man 3. Now this movie, there's a lot of controversy surrounding this movie. I mean, they ended up using the Ten Rings organization, who we did get mentioned in the first Iron Man movie. And then they have the character of the Mandarin. And we think it's like a really big terrorist that's with the Mandarin. But then when we find out who the Mandarin really is, and that he's not the real, legit Mandarin and leader of the Ten Rings organization, I was a little disappointed with that, and I think it probably deserves to be in the D tier. Again, really sad that it ended up doing that. But next up, we got Thor: The Dark World. Now, this is the sequel to the first Thor, and I will say it was sort of a downgrade from the first Thor movie, because you have these dark elves, and we do get introduced to one of the Infinity Stones in this movie, and I think it's the Reality Stone. And again, I think because the person who directed the first Thor movie did not come back for the second one, apparently whoever directed Thor: The Dark World was not very good at their job. So I'm probably going to put this in the D category as well, but right behind Iron Man 3. Next up, we got Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Now, this was the first movie to be directed by the directing duo of Anthony and Joe Russo, otherwise known as the Russo brothers, who went on to direct one of the greatest conclusions to this saga, to the first saga of the MCU, which I'll get to that in a little bit. But with Captain America: The Winter Soldier, it was a huge improvement from what the first Captain America was. In fact, I liked it so much that I probably prefer it over the first Iron Man movie. And it's actually, I may put it right in front of the first Avengers. I really enjoyed the way this movie went down. Next up, we got Guardians of the Galaxy. This is, just like the first Avengers movie, this is the next movie to have a team up, in a way, and it's based on intergalactic heroes. And you would think that the person who was directing this movie, James Gunn, we didn't think he could pull it off, but boy, was he able to pull off a good movie so much that I actually am going to put this in the A category. It was a really solid film, I gotta be honest. That's the way to start a team off, especially when it's a galactic superhero team. But now we're about to get into the nitty-gritty of some of the shows. Again, these weren't originally technically canon until they finally decided to introduce some of the characters from these shows into the MCU, played by the same actors. So they say they are considered canon now, but because they do kind of reference a lot of what happened during the events of the first Avengers movie in a lot of these shows. So first up, we got Daredevil. Now, I have seen all 3 seasons of Daredevil. However, some of these shows I actually have not seen. You may be surprised. But, so I'm going to have to go back and watch them in order to understand certain things. But with the 3 seasons of Daredevil, I gotta say, I love how they introduced not only Matt Murdock as Daredevil, but they also introduced Vincent D'Onofrio as Kingpin, who we did, again, just like Charlie Cox as Matt Murdock, we got Vincent D'Onofrio back as Kingpin in shows like Hawkeye and Echo, and we're about to get him in Daredevil Born Again, which is a sort of follow-up to this show. And I will say, these 3 seasons of Daredevil, it really shows like what happened after the events of the first Avengers movie. It seems like after the first movie, Avengers movies, aftermath really hurt a lot of people in the MCU. And again, I'll follow that up with another movie when we get to it. But with Daredevil and Kingpin in the show of Daredevil, I love the way they did this show, honestly. And they even introduced other characters that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And I gotta say, Daredevil probably fits into the A category for me. Again, really great show, great actors playing the characters of Kingpin and Daredevil, and I cannot wait to see what the future holds for them in the future of the MCU. Next up, we got Jessica Jones. Now, this may come as a shock, but I've only managed to watch the first season of Jessica Jones. Again, I may have to go back and watch seasons 2 and 3, and also seasons 1 and 2 of the other shows in order to fully understand what happened during certain events. But with the first season of Jessica Jones, I will say, just based on how I saw the first season, honestly, I think it was not too bad of a show, at least for the first season. So I'm probably just going to put it in the C category, probably in front of The Incredible Hulk. I will say, again, I've only seen the first season of this, so even though I technically haven't seen the whole thing, I'm not going to put it under haven't seen yet, because I've at least seen 1 season of it. Next up is Luke Cage, which, ironically, first show that is going to be put under the haven't seen category. And same goes for the Iron Fist show. So these are the only 2 Netflix shows that I haven't seen yet. I haven't seen anything of them. Again, I only saw 1 season of Jessica Jones, but I need to watch the other 2 seasons to fully understand certain things. But to be fair, I think only the first season of Jessica Jones takes place before our next show on this list, which is The Defenders. Now, I did watch The Defenders, especially because apparently there was something that happened before the event. This happened before the events of Daredevil Season 3, so I had to watch this in order to understand that. But apparently I didn't realize I had to watch all the other shows, and in order to understand it. At least the first seasons of Iron Fist and Luke Cage I still need to watch in order to fully understand why the events of the Defenders happened. But when it comes to the Defenders, it was nice to see like sort of a follow-up as to what happened during the events of the Daredevil Season 3, which we get a conclusion to his character. But I will say, I still think it's not as on par with what Daredevil was like. I'll probably put it just above Jessica Jones, at least for now. Again, I may do a rehash of this tier list once I see more stuff and once more and more MCU stuff comes out, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Next up is Avengers Age of Ultron. Now, this is the second Avengers movie in the lineup of the Avengers, and now I will say it was a downgrade from the first Avengers movie, in my opinion, because of the main villain Ultron, and it even introduces us to two mutants who back at when the movie was released, they didn't have access to the mutants yet, so they didn't actually call them mutants, they called them enhanced. But I will say this is probably going to go down here just above Iron Man 3 and Thor the Dark World, in my opinion. Next up, we got Ant-Man 1. I'm just going to call it Ant-Man 1. This is right after the aftermath of Age of Ultron, where it shows Scott Lang as a prisoner, as an ex-con who just gets out of prison and tries to make his life better, especially wanting to be a part of his daughter Cassie's life. But then he ends up falling into a superhero lifestyle that he never expected, and actually ends up becoming a hero. And again, I thought this was relatively solid. I mean, heck, I'll even say it was probably better than the Defenders and Jessica Jones so far. It was a really good grounded level movie, but not as good as I was hoping it to be. Next up is Captain America Civil War. Now, this is the third Captain America movie that takes place after the events of Age of Ultron, Winter Soldier, obviously. But this is when things really started to come full circle, because not only was this the first movie in Phase 3 of the MCU, but it sort of helps set up what happened during the events of the last two Avengers movies in this saga. And we even get introduced to our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, played by Tom Holland in this franchise. And I gotta say, this was a really good way to start Phase 3 of the MCU and then pick it up afterwards. And I gotta say, I'm really looking. In fact, I even think it's better than the Winter Soldier, in my opinion. And that's just me. Next up, we got Doctor Strange. Now, Doctor Strange is the first mythical and horror side of things, because it was actually the guy who directed this movie, Scott Derrickson, is a horror director, and I can see why. But Doctor Strange is, and funny enough, he actually was name dropped in Captain America the Winter Soldier. And I can see, and it's nice to see that they actually lived up to that. And heck, he was even referenced in the original 3 Spider-Man movies with Tobey Maguire, specifically Spider-Man 2, when they were trying to come up with a name for Dr. Octopus. And I love how they referenced that. But with this movie, again, I thought it was a solid film. I mean, it's not as good as I was hoping, but in fact, I think it's even better than the first Captain America movie and the first Thor movie. That's just me. Next up, we got Spider-Man Homecoming. Now, going back to what I was saying a little while ago about what happened after the events of the first Avengers movie, we get the character of Adrian Toomes, aka the Vulture, where he apparently was in charge of a cleanup crew that was supposed to clean up after the events of the first Avengers movie, but then the Avengers themselves got really upset, or got him really upset when they tried to take over the cleanup operations, and he got so angry that he decided to ended up turning to a life of crime, trying to help his family and all that. And it's funny how a lot of Spider-Man's villains in the MCU, at least for the first two Spider-Man movies, they were all pretty much they pretty much turned evil because of Tony Stark, and he was sort of the mentor to Spider-Man, at least at the beginning of his journey in the MCU. And I love how they actually, I will say, Tom Holland's Peter Parker is way not as good as Tobey Maguire's, I'll say, but it's still relatively solid. And I gotta say, I think the first Spider-Man movie probably goes over the first Doctor Strange, in my opinion. Definitely worth checking out. Next up, we got Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Now, just like the first Guardians of the Galaxy, this movie is, I mean, it's not as good as its first installment, but I will say it was nice to see Peter Quill learn a lot about his backstory, and we even get a little bit of backstory on Rocket, which we'll talk about that later on when we get to the third Guardians of the Galaxy movie. But with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, I think it was not as great as the first one, but I will say definitely fits into the B category for me. Next up, we got Thor Ragnarok. Now, this was, even though it was directed by Taika Waititi, and he's like a big fan of comedy, introducing comedy into his movies, I will say the way he did Thor Ragnarok was a solid effort, and so much so that I actually think it fits up here, probably in between Daredevil and the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie in the A category. I think it was relatively fun. Now we get into the last Marvel show to come out from the Netflix side of things before they decide to make it fully canon, and that's The Punisher. Now, I actually just finished watching both seasons of The Punisher recently, and I gotta say, the way they ended season 2, though, I was like, what is his future? Now, we do know that he's rumored to show up in Daredevil Born Again, so I'm curious to see if, like, what he's been up to since the events of since the ending of season 2 of The Punisher. So, but I will say this was pretty bloody. I mean, in his first appearance in Daredevil season 2, I gotta admit, was pretty crazy. But with Punisher, I actually would go so far as to say it is almost on par with Daredevil, but just barely in the A category. Again, pretty crazy if I'm being honest. Next up, we got Black Panther 1. This was the first movie to come out that actually centered around a non-white hero, in my opinion, and at least from one that I've seen. And the first Black Panther movie, I gotta say, pretty solid film. So much so that I'm probably gonna put it here just above The Punisher, in my opinion. Pretty solid film. Next up, we got Avengers Infinity War. This is part 1 of the conclusion to the Infinity Saga, and honestly, this is one of the first movies to end up on the S tier. Really solid film. This is a way to start off part 1 of the conclusion to the Infinity Saga. It had so many different character arcs and character developments. It was pretty shocking the way the movie ended, but not as crazy as when we get to the next movie for Avengers. Next up is Ant-Man and the Wasp. Now, this is the sequel to the first Ant-Man. I will say it is sort of a downgrade, so much so that I'll put it down here in the D category. Not much to talk about with this. I mean, it definitely wasn't as good as I was hoping it to be. Next up is the first Captain Marvel. Now, just like the first Captain America movie, this takes place before the events of the first Iron Man, and it shows Carol Danvers as to who she is. And I will say, I didn't like it as much as I thought I would. In fact, I'm probably going to put it just below the first Incredible Hulk movie, because honestly, it was an okay movie for when it first came out, but it's not something that I would probably want to repeat. Next up is Avengers Endgame. Again, part 2 and the conclusion of the Infinity Saga. Well, just barely. We still got one more movie that came out during the Infinity Saga, but I'm gonna count that as part of the multiverse saga in a way. So, but with Avengers Endgame, boy, was it a crazy ride. So much so that I'm actually gonna put it right above Infinity War. It was a worthy conclusion to the Infinity Saga, and I cannot wait to see how well the multiverse saga ends up doing. Because I will say the first half of this multiverse saga was okay, but then some parts of the second half of the multiverse saga so far have been half and half. So this is how I rank everything from the Infinity Saga. We still got one more that technically fits in with the Infinity Saga, but I'll get to that when we get to it. But right now we're going to do Spider-Man Far From Home. This is the second installment to the Spider-Man movies in the MCU. And I will say the villain in this movie was actually better than the first movie. So much so that I'm actually going to put it in the B category, probably right behind the first Iron Man. That's just me. I mean, Mysterio, I didn't think they were going to be able to pull him off in a theatrical sense, but boy, those special effects when they did that fight scene between him and Spider-Man was amazing. And once again, just like with Adrian Toomes in the first movie, Mysterio was unfortunately forced into villainy through Tony Stark, where if you remember in Captain America Civil War, he had that weird thing at MIT where he named it some experiment that he did, BARF. Apparently that was invented by Quentin Beck, and he didn't like that he named it that, and then he ended up firing him because he thought his technology could change the world for something better than what Tony used it for. And I'm hoping that now that once we get to No Way Home, that's going to be a different story, but I'll actually explain more once we get to that with Spider-Man. But now we get to the very first Marvel show that did come out from Disney Plus with WandaVision. This takes place right within a few weeks after the events of Avengers Endgame. We find out that Wanda has pretty much taken over an entire town of Westview, New Jersey, and she somehow created Vision again from her powers, but because he was created from her powers, he can't exist outside of the hex that she created. And this is also when we first get introduced to Agatha Harkness, who we will then see in the Agatha All Along show. Again, they keep changing the name of that show all the time. It was originally titled Agatha House of Harkness, then it was Agatha Coven of Chaos, then it was Darkhold Diaries, and now it's Agatha All Along. Like, I don't know what they're going to end up fully calling it, but we'll see what happens with that show. But with WandaVision, I will say it was a solid show, if I'm being honest. But if I had to say, it would probably go into at the bottom of the B category. Still a solid show, but I still feel like it could have been improved on a little bit with some of the characters that were introduced in here. Now we get to Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Now this is the first show, if I'm being honest, that actually I thought it was an okay introduction to the way things were, but so much so that I'm actually going to put it above WandaVision in the C category. It was definitely a worthy follow-up to WandaVision and sort of a precursor to the next movie that we're going to get after Deadpool and Wolverine, which is Captain America Brave New World. So we're going to see how well that ends up turning out. Now we get to one of the few shows, in my opinion, that is going to be in the A category for both seasons. Or S tier, sorry. Loki seasons 1 and seasons 2 were a worthy start to the multiverse saga. Because if y'all don't know, in Avengers Endgame, Loki actually escapes the 2012 timeline and actually with the Tesseract, and then he ends up being apprehended by the Time Variance Authority, who we did not know about until after the events of Avengers Endgame. And it's like Tony said in Avengers Endgame to Captain America, you mess with time, it tends to mess back. So I think that was sort of a precursor as to what is going to happen by the end of this saga with Secret Wars. So really solid show. Next up, we got Black Widow. Now, this is the last movie that takes place before the events of Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame, but it takes place after the events of Captain America's Civil War. And I will say, I thought it was a solid film, but I still think it wasn't as good as probably. Actually, I may well say it's probably better than the first Captain America movie, just in my opinion. But again, it introduced us to a lot of new characters, and we even get a follow-up as to what happened, or what was referenced in the first Avengers movie with Dreykov's daughter, and apparently Dreykov, who's in charge of this thing called the Red Room, which Natasha mentions in Age of Ultron. So, curious to see how well that ends up going. Next up, we got Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. To me, I thought this was one of the few movies, not aside from Spider-Man No Way Home, which we will get to, that I thought was pretty solid, and so much so that I actually think it deserves to be just in front of the first Iron Man movie in the B category. Solid film. Plus, we actually get the real Mandarin in this movie, even though he doesn't refer to himself as the Mandarin. But he's the real person in charge of the Ten Rings organization. And I'm curious to see how they're going to reintroduce the Ten Rings after the multiverse saga is done. But next we got the Eternals movie. Now, even though this was a team-up film, to a lot of people, this was actually one of those not-so-good films. Even though it was directed by an Academy Award-winning director, Chloe Zhao, I think is her name, I think it was the weakest movie of the multiverse saga films. So actually, we got another one coming up that may actually be worse than that. But next up, we got Hawkeye. I gotta say, Hawkeye is where the first show where we get reintroduced to Kingpin as sort of a main antagonist, and I really like how they set him up to continue on in this show. But I will say, though, he was pretty beat easily by Kate Bishop at the end of the Hawkeye show, for those of you who haven't seen Hawkeye, spoiler there. But I think it was so good that I'm probably going to put it just above Spider-Man Homecoming in the C category. Next up, we got Spider-Man No Way Home. Again, relatively solid film. I'm actually going to put it in front of Loki because it was a really solid film, in my opinion. Not really much to say about that. Next up is Moon Knight. Now, there are rumors that we're going to get a season 2 from Moon Knight, so I'm curious how well that's going to go. But Moon Knight, I gotta say, again, pretty solid show, but I actually think I prefer it over Falcon and Winter Soldier and WandaVision. That's just me. Next up is Multiverse of Madness, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, the sequel to the first Doctor Strange. I thought it was sort of an improvement on the first movie, in my opinion, much more entertaining, so much so that I'm actually going to put it right above WandaVision in the B category. Solid show, or movie, if I'm being honest. Next up is Miss Marvel. Now, Miss Marvel is the first superhero that is based off of a culture that, honestly, I don't know why so many people were not too fond of this. I thought it was pretty solid. Heck, I even find it better than the first Captain Marvel movie. And that's just me. Next up, we got Thor: Love and Thunder. Now, I mentioned how Thor Ragnarok was a pretty solid movie, but with Thor: Love and Thunder, it was sort of a downgrade to it. However, I will say it's definitely better than the first two Thor movies. So much so that I think I'm going to put it... Actually, no. I think I liked... There we go. I'm probably going to put it right beneath the first Thor movie. So Thor: The Dark World is the only one that's the worst one out of them. But Thor: Love and Thunder sort of follows suit with that. And it was a solid film, I'm not going to lie, but it was a downgrade from what Thor Ragnarok was, if I'm being totally honest. Heck, I even liked the first Thor movie over this one. Next up, we got She-Hulk: Attorney at Law. Now, I think the original plan for the She-Hulk show was, I think the way they were going to do it originally was probably a lot better than what it turned out to be, because they ended up shoving a bunch of, like, sort of politics in there, and to the point where they made it seem like they talk about, like, a bunch of female overpowerment and talking about men and all that. It was a weird show the way it turned out. In fact, it's probably gonna be the first show in the F tier, which really sucks because like I said, she did not know. I don't know what happened there, but like I said, She-Hulk could have done better, but in the end, it just ended up being in the F tier. Okay, so quick change of the screen here for a second. So next up, we got Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. Now, this is the sequel to the first Black Panther movie. Again, solid film, the first one, but because the unfortunate passing of Chadwick Boseman happened right before the filming of this movie, they had to sort of change it up a little bit. But I still think they did relatively well because the guy who directed the first movie came back to direct this one, and I gotta say, it was somewhat solid, so much so that I even like it over the first Spider-Man movie, Doctor Strange, and even Black Widow. And again, this is just me. Now we move on to Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. Now, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania to me was again, if you notice, I have the second movie in the D category. This movie is probably going to follow suit to that, but I will say I did like it a lot more over Iron Man 3, Thor: The Dark World, and Eternals, because it definitely... The main thing I really did not like about this movie was how they utilized the very first Ant-Man movie's villain in this movie, because he surprisingly came back, and the way they did his character dirty in the Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania was not so great. Now we move on to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Now, you may find this shocking, but I actually like this over the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie because it was a great way to conclude this trilogy of Guardians movies, so much so that I'm actually going to put it in the S tier so at least I have a top 5 MCU projects, one of which is a show and 4 of which are movies. And again, great way to end off the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy. Now, we could still see the Guardians show up again during the MCU multiverse saga, during Secret Wars possibly, but we'll see what happens. Next up, we got Secret Invasion. Now, unfortunately, this is another show that's going to go into the F tier because I haven't read the comics for Secret Invasion, but from what I'm hearing, the way they did this show was pretty dirty. It did not follow the whole thing of Secret Invasion at all, and what they did at the end was probably going to lead to nowhere, in my opinion. And then we move on to, unfortunately, the first movie to probably be put in the F tier for the Marvel Universe, The Marvels. I'm sorry, but I will say I did still like it more than She-Hulk and Secret Invasion, but regardless, it's still an F tier movie. I don't know what they were thinking with this movie. I mean, we get introduced to two major characters in two different shows. We in WandaVision and Miss Marvel, both of which were solid shows, with Monica Rambeau being older and Kamala Khan. They were both introduced in their own shows, or at least Miss Marvel was, and her show wasn't even that bad. But unfortunately, the way they handled the Marvels was not so good, in my opinion. So, I'm sorry, but that's just my honest opinion. And lastly, we have Echo, the most recent Marvel show to come out before we get the biggest movie with Deadpool and Wolverine. Cannot wait to see how that turns out. I have a feeling that's going to end up in my S or A tier the next time I do this video. But for Echo, I gotta say, it wasn't as good as the Hawkeye show was, in my opinion. However, I will say it probably is better than Jessica Jones. And this is just my opinion. Again, I have to watch the season 2 and season 3 of Jessica Jones in order to understand the plan is there, but still, pretty solid show. So that's my tier list for all the MCU movies and shows, which includes the Netflix stuff. Again, the only two things I have not seen out of all of these has been the Luke Cage, Iron Fist, in their entirities, and I still need to watch seasons 2 and 3 of Jessica Jones to sort of understand this a little bit better. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching this tier list video, and as always, I will see all you guys in the next video.